Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? You tend to look at the world through a positive filter or a negative filter. I'm Dr. David Murphy. I'm a physician and I'm a medical psychotherapist from Leamington, Ontario. And perhaps you've noticed too how we tend to look at the world in two ways, this or that, good or evil, extrovert, introvert. We tend to find type A personality, type B personality. We have a tendency to subdivide into two, and optimism, pessimism is one of those same ideas. We all tend to be a bit more of an optimist or a bit more of a pessimist. I've heard it read that an optimist and a pessimist will be right and wrong about the same amount of times. It's just that the optimist will be happier. And I think that's probably true. If you have that tendency to be a pessimist, you're more likely to be sad, to be depressed, to focus on loss, and you will find it difficult to meet your outcomes. An optimist, on the other hand, will tend to look on failure perhaps as an opportunity to learn, and will view it from a positive point of view. So is one better than the other? Well, perhaps, and perhaps not. I think there's a role to play for all of us to have some optimism and pessimism in us, to have some balance in that way between optimism and pessimism. An optimist, of course, will go into an outcome determined that it will happen and will not look for problems ahead of time and will deal with problems as they arise and will go into that with a positive attitude. A pessimist, on the other hand, will have a tendency to notice the problems before starting, to attempt to analyze the situation, to imagine all the possible problems and solve those problems before starting, which can delay the process. And of course, optimists and pessimists tend to have rather negative viewpoints of each other. The optimist says, oh, you're so negative. You're always thinking the worst. And then the pessimist will say, well, you're just not being realistic. And the optimist might say, well, you're just another cynic. And the pessimist might say, well, you know, to be in touch with reality, you've got to be a little cynical. So there are different ways of looking at the optimism and the pessimism. And I think they both have a role to play. I must say I've got a fair degree of pessimism in my personality, but I have, over the years, made a concerted effort to include optimism in my attitude to how I move through life. And I found it works really, really well together. I think I probably learned to be a pessimist because I was a Boy Scout. And the motto of the Boy Scouts is be prepared. So I was constantly looking for problems so I could be prepared for them. At the same time, I think that's made me an effective doctor, particularly when I was practicing anesthesia. A lot of things can go wrong in an anesthetic, and I found it very helpful to be prepared for possible problems. So the pessimist in me would sometimes draw up medications in syringes for a particular patient or particular surgery, just in case a particular problem came up. And if it did, I was ready to go. I had my syringe filled. All I had to do was inject the medication and the problem was resolved. Instead of perhaps the optimist might say, oh, everything will be all right. Now I didn't like to be scrambling to find the medication to draw up and get ready. For me, that took too much time. If, though, the problem didn't arise, I just threw the medications away. A little bit of a waste, wasting syringes and needles, the medications, but I felt that was well worth it. Overall, for me, that had a benefit. So I think there is a place for pessimism, and yet without optimism, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to achieve outcomes. When we set a goal, we're living in the present. We're setting our goal, we're saying, this is where I am, this is where I want to be. We're living in the present. When we set an outcome, now we're deciding what is going to happen. Now we're living in the future. And optimists have a tendency to be able to imagine that outcome. They can visualize it as if it's already happened. Optimist then is more likely to achieve outcomes, which is why they are more likely to be happier, because success breeds happiness. It breeds contentment. It boosts self-esteem. It builds confidence. At the same time, though, I believe that it is possible to blend that optimism and pessimism. Imagine that outcome achieved. Be positive. Be positive that it's going to happen. And at the same time, spend a little bit of time imagining any possible blocks to achieving that outcome. And you might well be able to prevent those things occurring by imagining them happening. So I find what you can do is you can blend that optimism and pessimism, and it then becomes what is being called practical optimism. It's optimism with boundaries. It's optimism with checks and balances. It's optimism that I believe will create even more success because you're including just the right amount of pessimism. I've always felt that every committee that's there to do a job and make things happen, every committee needs a pessimist. They're not always very popular because they tend to be negative and they tend to look at the problems, but they will help you prevent problems just by bringing them up. So we all need that little bit of a pessimist in us, just along that journey with the optimist, working together as a team. I'm Dr. David Murphy.